Hey everyone, welcome to On Tap. I'm Chris, and I'm not an expert, just a guy who enjoys good beer. Let us once again discuss beer from Germany, in this case the Weihenstephaner Brewery, which is, if rumors to be believed, the oldest brewery in the world. Hallo und jetzt es ist Bierzeit. So, let's talk some German beer. Now, Weihenstephaner is one of those core German brands that I would say I can definitely find in certain select stores, but it's absolutely a cut above sort of your garden variety stuff. There might be a good reason for that. You see, the breweries at Weihenstephaner have had a little bit of time to work on and twiddle with their recipe, about 1,000 years, give or take. So yes, the Weihenstephaner Brewery is really, really old. Located on top of Weihenstephan Hill in the town of Freising, which is northeast of Munich, or München, Weihenstephaner has a bit of a murky history in terms of when it was founded. You see, the brewery claims to have been founded in 1040 when a letter in the 1950s was discovered that talked about a bishop sort of giving brewing rights to the local abbey. If that is true, it would make the Weihenstephan Brewery effectively the oldest still functioning brewery on planet Earth. However, people claim that that letter from the 1950s was a forgery and that sort of you couldn't conclusively prove that the brewery had been founded any earlier than about 1675. Either way, though, there definitely is a long history of brewing at the Weihenstephan Abbey. Allegedly, the abbey was founded in the 700s when St. Corbinian arrived and built a first structure in 720. And yes, 720, like 250 years after the fall of the Roman Empire, which, if that's the case, that's going back a little ways, a little while. Back when Bavaria actually didn't even have the city of Munich, and Bavaria as a concept really didn't exist, so that whole area would have just been, open land and a couple of farms. Anyway, while that's, quite a ways in the past, we even got some evidence of beer brewing taking place within the reasonable sort of confines of that area. There's a letter from 768 talking about the Weihenstephan Brewery having a hop garden, and we could only guess what a hops garden is being used for by a bunch of medieval monks. So in conclusion, when was Weihenstephaner founded? Well, any time from 1040 or before to up to 1675. It's a pretty wide range of dates. And part of the issue with dating the founding of the brewery might stem from the fact that the monastery had sort of a nasty habit of, how do I put this delicately, getting burned to the ground by marauding armies from about 950 to about 1650. I mean, hey, Bavaria was a pretty rough place back then, but it definitely doesn't do us any favors in terms of having solid records that we can actually use to prove conclusive dates. The brewery remained part of the abbey for centuries until in 1803 the Bavarian government acquired the property, it shut down the abbey, but it kept the brewery, renaming it the Bayerische Staatsbrauerei Weihenstephan, or the Bavarian State Weihenstephaner Brewery. And ever since then, 1803, the Weihenstephan Brewery has remained a state-run Bavarian enterprise. So even though the Weihenstephan Brewery is a state-run enterprise, it still is operated like a company, as in, it doesn't require subsidies from the government and it is still expected to turn a tidy profit. Now, this brewery has won a fair number of awards, both sort of gold and silvers, at lots of different beer competitions around the world. A number of their beers, especially their Weissbiers, to be discussed in part 2, have won gold and silver at the World Beer Awards, along with, of course, their classic lager. And one of these days we will definitely do a German beer taste test, or let me rephrase that. I will do several German beer taste tests, as the Germans do tend to know what they're doing when it comes to brewing beer. The Weihenstephan Brewery also trains up a large number of brewers who then go on to work at other establishments around the world, thus keeping the German brewing tradition alive and well. Weihenstephaner has its own college, in effect, the Weihenstephan School of Life Sciences, and you can go to this college if you want to learn to be a brewer. There are other subjects you can study as well, and people do go there to pursue other careers, but those are also mostly pretty much like food and drink related. The school, aside from learning how to brew beer, research is conducted on brewing and ingredients. People test things, and students learn about concepts like how do you get consistency of flavor despite varying harvests and weather events? How does temperature, pressure, and humidity affect beer? Having studied all of this, as you can imagine, the students of the Weihenstephan School of Life Sciences are in very high demand as brewers once they graduate. And I understand that it's pronounced Weihenstephaner, and I got that information from Feely in Germany's YouTube video.
Whether it's at the store or at a bar, Weihenstephaner.
Anyway, she made the argument that Weihenstephaner is actually not super available throughout most of Germany proper, but rather it's a very popular beer in Bavaria, and it also has a big export focus. And that certainly lines up with what I've seen, where when I go into American beer stores, I'll notice that Weihenstephaner is certainly available, usually a couple varieties, and it's next to the likes of other sort of more quality German export brands such as Hofbrau, Spaten, Paulaner, Schneiderweisse, etc., etc. And also just in general, if you're interested in a modern German perspective on various things, her channel's quite good. So in this episode, we're going to discuss a lot of Weihenstephaner's most popular non-Weissbiers. And the Weissbiers, we're going to talk about that in part 2. So this episode, effectively, it's the lager contingent. Original Premium, otherwise known as Original Helles, Helles meaning light, bright, or pale in the Bavarian dialect of German. This is going to be a classic light Bavarian lager with a straw yellow color and sort of a smooth, slightly malty, very barely hoppy body to it. Essentially, the classic drink of Bavaria. Pils. The Pilsner, or Pils, is going to be a slightly hoppier version of the Helles, with a little bit more of a balance between malt and hops. And in this case, the hops is going to be of a slightly floral nature. 1516 Kellerbier. Named in honor of the 500th anniversary of the Reinheitsgebot, or German beer purity law, this beer is going to be a little heavier in body, and it's going to be an amber color with sort of some smooth, rich, malty caramel notes, though there is going to be a touch of hops just to add a tiny bit of bitterness. Festbier. This is a seasonal lager known as a Märzen, or Marzen for Americans, typically consumed around Oktoberfest. So this is a style of lager that's going to have, again, a bit of a kind of heavier body to it. It's going to be a dark golden color, and it's going to have a mix of sort of smooth, slightly sweet, malty flavors, along with just a touch of hops. Corbinian. The Corbinian is a Doppelbock, or style of extra strength dark lager that in this case has a 7.4% ABV. The beer has a very full bodied, it's going to be dark in color, and have a mix of sort of rich roasted malt flavors along with some sweetness. Now it is time for my favorite part of the episode, tasting. Let's get to it. So first up, we have the Weihenstephaner Original, or the Weihenstephaner Helles. A very light, maybe not quite straw yellow, but a very pale yellow lager color. Nice fluffy head on this. And that's a very nice lager. That is light, but it doesn't feel thin. It has just a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit of sweetness to it, but again, not in sort of an overly sweet way. Just the faintest hint of kind of almost like refreshing grain, or like, you know, refreshing sort of barley, that kind of thing. But it's very light. It's just a touch, and this beer has a nice clean finish, a nice sort of light, well balanced kind of mouthfeel. It's reasonably nice and smooth, being a non-Pilsner sort of Helles lager. I'm going to take a second taste. Yeah, I would say on the second drink, there's just a tad more crispness in the beer, but again, not much in the way of hoppiness. It's really just sort of an extra note. This definitely leads with more sort of mix of mostly malt, but there's a little bit of hops to give it sort of that slight edge, but really not too much. And I got a little bit less sweetness in the second drink there, but it's still, all in all, very balanced. A really, really nice, just good example of, in my opinion, what a Bavarian lager should be. Good quality beer. Let's move on. Next up, we have the Pilsner, or the Pils. So this beer is should be very similar to this one, but essentially you're just dialing up the hops, and this is gonna have, you're dialing up the hops, and this is gonna have a little bit more, should hopefully have a little bit more sharpness and a little bit more sort of a floral kind of hoppy flavor. So almost about the same color. This one might even be maybe a tad more pale. Nice fluffy head as well. Yeah, that's a good Pilsner. This is actually a great example of how you can have different flavor profiles in two subtypes of lagers, right? So this is a lager that has basically it's got more hops in it. So it's a similar beer in many ways to this one, but there's no sense of sweetness in this at all. And it's got much more of a crisp bite to it, which is very characteristic of a Pilsner. And what this also doesn't have is, I would say, as much kind of smoothness to it. Again, it's very clean, but it's exceptionally crisp. This one is more, I would say, clean and smooth. This one is more clean and crisp. And this is non-sweet. This is ever so slightly, just barely imperceptibly sweet. And on the second drink, I can get a little bit more floral kind of hops taste in this. Sometimes with hops and certain like IPAs and things, you could get more of almost like a piney hops, or sort of a really dry, sort of herbaceous feel that's not exactly so much floral. And this has a really, really nice, at least for my taste, really, really nice sort of floral kind of hops component to it. All right, let's continue on. So now for beer 3 out of 5, the Weihenstephaner 1516 Kellerbier. Named in honor of the 1516 purity law, the Reinheitsgebot, specifying that you can only put water, malt, hops, and eventually yeast in the beer. Yes, now this, definitely less of a head on this, not so much of a fluffy head, and more of a middle to dark gold rather than sort of a light straw yellow. It's very nice. How I would almost describe it is if you took this beer, you took the original premium, you just upped the body and you upped the sweetness and you just upped the general mouth feeling of a slightly sweet, smooth, reasonably rich lager beer. That's kind of what this tastes like. There's a tiny little bit, a tiny little bit of bitterness in this, but it's not a lot. It's very much it's a very rounded flavor. It's a very sort of rounded and full kind of flavor. It doesn't leave my palate though particularly, like overwhelmed or anything, so it's still reasonably clean, but definitely it's got a little bit more weight to it, so it's not quite as, quote, clean, you would say, as these, but that's not the style it's going for. Take another taste. Yeah. It's basically, it's this if you just wanted to dial everything up a bit more, and it moves into being like a heavier version of a lager. Almost like, this is probably a bad analogy to use, but almost like if you took, like wine or something. Let's imagine you've got a very young wine that hasn't aged very long, right? And it's kind of light and it's a little fruity and it's got kind of, some bright notes to it. Something like this, right? And then you took that same wine, but you just kept it in the cask for a lot longer. It's the same mix of stuff, but it's just been sitting there a lot longer, so you've just got a little bit of a higher alcohol content, just like a heavier, slightly thicker type of drink. And that's effectively what this is. So I quite like that. I'm gonna put this up here. Now let's see how these stack up to beer number 4, the Festbier. This is a Märzen style. Also, note on the neck here, this pattern, the white and blue diamond sort of check, is basically the flag of Bavaria. And you see this sort of coloration a lot on a lot of kind of like traditional German beer and food things, because it relates to Bavaria, which is kind of a major center of German beer production and kind of German beer culture. Very similar color and sort of light fluffy head to the original Helles and the Pils. So this is interesting. That tastes very similar to the original. This is very interesting, and I might have to do second tastings after this, but it's almost like if you've got your original, and this is kind of like the youngest, the lightest, the most kind of, clean and bright, kind of smooth, slightly crisp kind of Helles lager beer. This is the one that's been sitting in the cask, so to speak, for a reasonably long period of time. Enough that it's got a little bit of weight to it. This is like the one that splits the difference between these two. This one's more like maybe it's like 20% kind of a little heavier in body, a little richer than kind of the original, but it's not quite at the level of this one. So it's a very interesting continuum actually, and you can almost in a way see, like almost in like a brewing sense, like what would happen if you took barley, water, malt, and yeast, and you put it in a barrel, and then you let it ferment for different periods of time, and you put the same ratio in, and you were like, we're gonna have barrel number 1, barrel number 2, barrel number 3, and we're gonna keep one brewing for a little bit of time, another one time plus X, and then another one time plus XY. This is the first one, this is time plus X, this is time plus XY, and they all have very similar, but also kind of slightly different flavors to them. So it's very interesting. I'm gonna take another taste. Okay, on the second taste, what I would say is this does have a little bit more crispness to it than these two. So I'm gonna amend what I just said. I'm gonna have to backtrack here a little bit. This is like a beer that's on the continuum of this, but if you took a little bit of that Pilsner crispness and you kind of mixed it in, so it's essentially like a cross between the 3 other beers on the table. This is what you would get. You would get some crispness, some basic light, bright, malty, kind of cleanliness, and then a little bit, not a ton, but a little bit of kind of extra weight to it. Very nice. Gonna have to think about how these are all gonna get ranked, because they're all very well done beers, they just have slightly different flavor profiles. But let's see how they all compare to the 5th and final beer of this episode, which comes in a very large bottle, the Korbinian Doppelbock. And it's actually funny, this style of bottle, this kind of, basically it's like a pint plus a couple ounces bottle. I noticed very specifically with certain kind of German beers in particular. Nice fluffy head on that, and very beautiful, very dark brown. Yes, that does it for me. That is just what I was hoping it was going to be. This is a rich, medium-bodied, I wouldn't say exceptionally heavy-bodied, but definitely a very medium-bodied, higher alcohol strength, but still smooth, malty, rich, sweet example of a lager beer. If you took a lager beer and you turned it up to 11, right? I mean, the Doppelbock is effectively, well, aside from the Eisbock, I haven't tried I haven't had an Eisbock, but aside from that, a Doppelbock's basically about the highest strength version of a lager you can get. Using that analogy of fermenting wine, right, in a barrel, and the longer you ferment the wine, the more kind of potent it's going to get. Which, by the way, is same case for beer. I'm not so much of an expert on wine, so I'm just thinking about the body of wine, right? But with beer, very much there's an element of that, right? The longer you ferment it, and the more kind of stuff you do to it before you just kind of take it out of the barrel and kind of serve it, the richer, the heavier, the stronger you can make your beer. With the Korbinian, that's very much what you have. This is really more of a top shelf type of beer. So this is technically a lager. Like, this is actually a style of beer that is officially, in some basic brewing, basic brewing parlance, it is the same category of beer as a lot of the other stuff here on the table. It's just this, you're really dialing up kind of the brewing process up to 11. And that is very nice. Moving this over here. This is rather difficult actually, because normally I like to rank these where I can have a couple beers tie, but I gotta say, all of these are very good quality. I'm gonna need to do a little bit of assessment and see which of these is best. Okay, so I've done my assessment, and as best I can figure, this is approximately how I would rank these. Now, let me explain how I've sort of lined these 3 bottles up. I want to first say, none of these beers are bad or unacceptable or not drinkable. Every single one of these beers here, especially for the style of just classic German beer, are good to very excellent. I'd endorse kind of any of them. That being said, if we get into the weeds here and we go into, well, which of the good beers are better than the other good beers, definitely I would say the 3 that are not as good are the original premium, the Pilsner, and the Festbier. They're a little bit less complex, let's say, in beer style than the 1516 Kellerbier or the Corbinian. Yes, I get there's a certain amount of comparing apples and oranges here. The original Helles, the Pils, and the Festbier are sort of very good examples of beer in their particular categories. And the Corbinian is, while it's still a lager, it is a different, really, style of lager. So I fully understand that. However, just in terms of the complexity of the beer, the brewing craft involved, all of that, I have to say, at the back of the pack, we've got the original Helles and the Pilsner. And then the Festbier, I would say, just barely kind of leads out these two really just by a nose. But these three effectively are in kind of one category, followed by the 1516 Kellerbier and then the Corbinian. The original Helles is a very nice, clean, smooth, refreshing, light, well-balanced, classic Bavarian lager. And there's just a tiny, tiny hint of sweetness to it. The Pilsner, the Pils, is essentially that with more hops to it. And then the Festbier is honestly very similar to these two. You know, there's maybe a little bit of a similarity to this. I'm going to backtrack a bit and say it's maybe not quite as much as I said before, but the Festbier is certainly, I think, a mix of these two, and it takes good elements from both. There's a little bit of the smoothness that you get with the original premium. There's a little bit of that kind of sharp crispness that you get with the Pils, and there's just a tiny, tiny sort of, hiding all the way at the back there, little bit of sweetness, like in the original, but also that you get in the 1516 Kellerbier. So I think this is the nicest one out of these three. Now moving up to the Kellerbier, what I like about this is the fact that it just has the feeling of like the original or the Festbier, but just it's just dialed up a little bit more. There's more of that smoothness, there's more of that, sweetness, not overly sweet, just a kind of barley sweet, kind of grain sweet in it. The body is a little thicker, it's a little stronger, and it's just a very nice, enjoyable, smooth kind of drink. I've said this with certain beers in the past, but a really, really good beer to have in, kind of like an Oktoberfest kind of environment, September, early October, spring as well. Same thing, and this would be true, for the Festbier as well, kind of a March, April, September, October kind of environment. But as nice as these all are, I definitely do have to give it to the Corbinian in first place. I mean, this Doppelbock is it's a really, really nice beer, and it's got just that depth of flavor, that depth of complexity to it. Though, given that it's a lager, it's not super heavy compared to some other beers. It's more medium heavy. This is I would say, in the scheme of like high, top shelf, maybe not quite tip-top shelf, but sort of upper middle, shelf beer in terms of like higher quality stuff. This is going to have sort of a good solid medium body with a good blend of alcohol, more of those kind of sweet barley grain kind of notes, and a very good just kind of, rich lager-like smoothness to it, just dialed up to 11. I think at the end of the day, and maybe, if the brewery's been around for 1,000 years, they've been working things out, they've, got something right. What I think is so nice about these beers is they really represent, especially I think these two, this one, and even these ones to a certain degree, they really represent a sense of the essence of a style of beer, at least as the Germans would make them, but as we would think of like different versions of what a lager can be. Like if you want to see what are all of the versions of a lager, and and we'll do a video on this at some point. If you want to see, like as I said before, like if you take that same amount of water and barley and hops and yeast, and you just do slightly different things to that same collection of stuff, while adjusting some variables, right? You do a little bit more hops, or you do a little bit less hops. This is just a really nice sampling of the kinds of drinks you can get when you just manipulate a couple of very basic variables. Water, malt, hops, and yeast, based on the German Reinheitsgebot that was established in Bavaria. So with just a very set number of ingredients, this Bavarian brewery really, I think, can show you in some ways how varied, relatively speaking, those flavor profiles can be, given that you're only dealing with 4 ingredients. So yeah, all in all, I would say very good job to Weihenstephaner. If you can find any of these in stores, check them out. Yeah, obviously this one's my favorite, but honestly, any of them I think would do the trick in the right situation. Let me know what you think. Let me know in the comments. You know, like this video if you want to, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I hope you sort of enjoyed my assessment, and I'll see you next time.